time. We'll be talking to Jim coming up to 12 o'clock. Today, PK at rte.ie for emails. You can text us on 51551. Well, just how grave is our current financial predicament? Crisis? Disastrous? Those are being used to describe the situation. Reckless and incompetent are being applied to the government. They're just some of the words bandied around as the government battles to rescue the country's struggling economy. On Morning Ireland, the former Finance Minister, Labour's Rory Quinn, sharply criticised the government's performance.
It could get far worse. I've been saying this since the middle of July. In articles that I've written, in commentaries that I've made to different radio stations, including RTE, we have a government that is in total denial. We also have a government, quite frankly, that is so badly led, it's exhausted. They're not talking to each other. They're a beaten team. You see them in Dáil Éireann, you look across them, they're less than 5 metres away in terms of physical facial expression, and they're absolutely bust. This is not Munster that we're looking at. This is the worst government I have ever seen in my entire 35 years in Leinster House.
Rory Quinn not putting a tooth in it. On the same programme, Finance Minister Brian Lenihan said there was no question of a new budget, promised that the government would provide strong leadership, and hinted that the pay increases promised under the partnership agreement would not be forthcoming.
I think we've made it clear that the payroll costs in the public service can't be immune from the trends we're seeing in the wider economy. I'm not going to predict this morning where we're going to end on this, but what I am saying...
But why not, Minister? Because that's actually what people are wondering out there. And as Rory Quinn was saying, people want to know what the numbers are going to be, how they're going to manage as individuals in the year ahead. So if you're going to be giving them a pay cut, could you not tell them and let them know, so we could all at the start of this January start to plan how we're going to manage to tighten our belts in the year ahead?
The government will provide a lead in this area this month. We are engaged in an intensive round of discussions with the social partners beginning of the next few days, and at the conclusion of that the government will make decisions about how we go forward from here. The point I'm making about the payroll costs is this: we have seen in the private sector workers taking substantial adjustments, workers being laid off, ensuring that their businesses are competitive. We see in the property market that the housing market is correcting itself, that the cost of houses is in decline. The public sector cannot be immune from those trends. We have to discuss that with those who represent them. There are 330,000 workers in the public service. They're entitled to have their voice heard before the government makes a final decision on this matter, which the government will make.
Finance Minister Brian Lenihan. Well, it's been estimated that the government will need to borrow €45 million a day to finance the running of the state. So where's the money going to come from to arrest the fiscal crisis? Is there any light ahead amid the gloom, for example, of growing job losses? Joining me on the line now is economist David McWilliams. David, good morning to you.
Good morning, Myles. How are you?
I'm very well. Better than the economy, I think, at the moment, for the look of things, by the sound of things. How big is this hole exactly? We've got a revenue shortfall for 2008, which was finalised yesterday. We've got, in terms of the borrowing required for 2009, or in 2009, additional borrowing for capital purposes. And then we've got a 2009 revenue shortfall to look forward to based on a contraction of the economy of 4%. So, roughly speaking, what do you imagine? How big is the hole?
Well, Myles, it looks that the hole is going to be about 16 or 17 billion euros this year. Now, that is a huge figure given where we've come from. What I do find interesting about all these discussions is the fact that all this was avoidable had advice been listened to about 3 or 4 or even 5 years ago. Those of us, and there were very few of us, who said this was a huge bubble about to burst, we were ridiculed and laughed at. The bubble has now burst, and we are facing what most countries dread, which is a situation where huge reductions in government spending have to come at the same time as huge redundancies in the private sector. We've seen it in Waterford, we've seen it in Tara Mines, we're going to see it all across the country. And what really annoys me is that the very people who got us into this mess in the first place are still sitting on the government benches talking about how they're going to get out of this mess.
And on the boards of banks.
And on the boards of banks, on the boards of public sector companies. Let's not just focus on the banks. If you look at what has happened in Ireland, there has been a coup d'etat of vested interests close to the state in the last 5 or 6 years, and their men and women are all now in extremely powerful positions. And the average taxpayer is the person who's been told, you've got to stump up, you've got to come up with the money, despite the fact that the people who ran the country into the ground, ridiculed those of us who were critical, those of us who were skeptical, are now saying, don't worry, we have a plan B. That, I think, is the scary vista. Now, let's look at the numbers, because you asked me about the numbers. But it's important to actually look at the politics of the situation as well, and look at the sort of pathetic vista that we've got ourselves into as a country which didn't need to get ourselves into this position. We have a 17 billion shortfall. That is the difference between the amount of money the government is getting in and the amount of money it's spending. The crucial issue, if we look at government spending, is 20 billion of the 55, all told, the government spends about 55 billion euros in the economy every year. The biggest item there, individual item, is 20 billion, which is public sector pay and pensions. Now, it's inconceivable that any reduction in spending will come without a serious reduction in public sector pay and pensions. And I suppose that's where the big possible showdown, a partnership.
Because you're not just talking about abandoning the percentage increase due in the public sector in September, you're talking about actual cuts in pay.
I think you have to look, let's say the best case scenario, right? If I was sitting there as Brian Lenihan, the best case scenario he can hope for is that he brings the government spending back to where he forecast in October, which seems like light years ago, Myles. But if you go back to the budget of October, he said that the Department of Finance hope that the total budget deficit for the year will be about 6.5 or 6% of total gross domestic product.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Now that would be a figure about 11 or 12 billion, let's say, right? We're now looking at 17 or 18 billion. They will have to, if the best case scenario is to bring it back to the October scenario. So that means cutting maybe between 5 and 6 billion, cutting out of public sector pay, number one, the social welfare budget, number two. These are really difficult things to do, because how do you reduce a social welfare budget if unemployment is rising by 5,000 a week? And as we've seen, that's without the huge, big Waterfords and our Tara Mines disastrous announcements. So this is his dilemma, and the problem is, and it's not blaming the public sector workers because it wasn't their fault. It's not the fault of teachers and guards and nurses that we're in this predicament. Arguably, it's the fault of those much closer to the state, much higher up, much cozier with the cartel that runs this country. But ultimately, the reduction in public sector pay will come. Now, what is interesting is they have this board snip NUA triumvirate in, and I think over the course of the next month, and Minister Lenihan hinted at it this morning, I think you will see serious reductions in government expenditures being slated by this new board snip.